Okay, greetings everyone and welcome to the video on figurative language. Before we start, please make sure you have some pencil and paper out. You'll want to take some notes, and also make sure you've got your book, The Lost City of the Monkey God, out. You'll need that as well. And I think that's it. So I think we're ready to get started. First, we should define it. What is figurative language? So think about when you're reading, you probably learned figurative language for the first time when you were in K-12, when they taught a poetry unit. And they taught you things like similes and metaphors, and they taught you how to read them and what they mean and why a poet might use them. But figurative language is really used by authors of every genre. Preston in our book uses figurative language all the time. And actually, this presentation was on my lesson plan weeks ago. So we've been kind of ignoring it up till now, and we're so sorry, Preston, because we really should have been paying attention to how beautiful your language and what a beautiful writer he is. And so that's what we're going to take some time and appreciate today. The reason Preston is using figurative language is when he doesn't want the language to have a literal meaning. It just adds depth to what he's writing. It might help create an image in our mind because he's using the language to mean something else. It's going to enhance his style. Like I told you, he's such an amazing writer, and that this is one of the reasons he's so good, is because he's really good at using those similes and metaphors and personification, and I'm going to go over all of that in this presentation. But I want you to realize that figurative language is not just for some poetry unit. It's used all the time by authors, and it really just helps enhance their writing overall. So there's all sorts of types. So you can look, we're going to go over these types in the order, but this slide has definitions and examples that are more general. The ones I'm going to show you on the next couple slides all have to do with the Monkey God book. But again, if you need to look back later, especially when you're doing your assignment, this is a quick, easy place to look and see all of the different types. Okay, so the first one we're going to go over is alliteration. And alliteration is the repetition of beginning sounds. So an author might do that for emphasis. Usually it creates some kind of mood, and often it's just really fun sounding. One of my favorite places for this actually happened in chapter 1, and I probably pointed it out to you then because I read chapter 1 to you. So here's your example, and I highlighted the repetition of those initial sounds. Do you see that the D's are all highlighted? That's what we mean with alliteration. So here's your example. From the air, it looked like a sun-dappled tropical paradise, not the dangerous, dank, disease and snake-infested jungle Woody was picturing. So when you think about that, think about why did he use that there? What does that repetition of the D sound, what does that do to the text overall? Really, it should, here it's for emphasis, right? Because he's, remember the line that came after this is he goes, yeah, we're going to be fine, right? And so this really punches forward Woody's message. If you think about what was Woody trying to do with that scary speech he gave in that conference room, it's dangerous, it's dank, it's disease-ridden, right? Like that's what we got from it. And so that message is really punched home by the repetition of those D sounds, which again is alliteration. Okay, so next is assonance, and that's the repetition of vowel sounds. So, and again, the same reason that an author uses alliteration is why they would use assonance. It's the same thing, emphasis, fun, and to create some kind of mood. So here, the example, and you're going to remember where this came from. My flashlight's feeble beam was fading. This is when Preston saw the snake. And I think that the use of assonance there, that repetition of the E sound, really emphasizes how dumb you would have to be to go into this jungle with some kind of crank up flashlight. And again, why would he leave the group and go off by himself? Woody told them not to do that. And then he, of course, the first night does it, and then, of course, encounters a fer-de-lance and is almost killed. And so that setup of that scene, he's going to use some different I guess, strategies to emphasize that. And here you've got feeble and you've got beam, because Preston was really foolish to do this, and so that really emphasizes that. Okay, next you have hyperbole. Hyperboles are exaggerations. You probably hear these a lot when people are upset. They tend to exaggerate to really bring their point home. If I was stuck in traffic, especially as they were doing all that construction on I-35, I might say something like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm late to class today. There were a million cars on the road. I sat there forever," right? That's exaggeration. And there I'm trying to get a hint at that I just sat in traffic for a really long time. No, I didn't count the cars. No, I don't know how many there were. And of course I wasn't there forever. But you, as hearing that, would understand that I was frustrated and that that was out of the ordinary. And so an exaggeration really helps to get a point across that way. Authors can also use it to be funny, because sometimes you exaggerate to such a degree that it's just absurd. Right? Sometimes it's sarcasm. It certainly creates a mood. The traffic example was certainly one of anger. And then you would know that I was frustrated, right? And that would be delivering a message. So here's an example of a hyperbole from chapter 10 of Monkey God. "I would never go back up that river. That's the most dangerous place on the planet, that river." Now, Bruce is talking about the Rio Patuca there. And if you remember, that's the chapter where he talks about getting, I think he gets hit and knocked into the water, and there's all these like crocodiles and stuff in the water, and that's when he comes up with his gun and he shoots the guys and ties them and to the canoe and sends them towards the crocodiles. Like, that's that scene. And then that's when he replies, "I would never go back up that river. That's the most dangerous place on the planet." I mean, is it really the most dangerous place on the planet? Maybe. It's certainly exaggeration, but we certainly know that Bruce was not happy to be there. It was a very terrifying experience and he does not want to go back. Okay. Next, you have idioms. Idioms are expressions that don't make literal sense. So the one that Steve Elkins actually uses is when he says, it's in chapter 17, "Enough people now knew the location of T1, Steve said, that the cat was out of the bag." Now, the cat was out of the bag is the example of an idiom, because it's an expression that doesn't make literal sense. There really is no cat, there's no bag, and there's no cat out of the bag. And so why do writers use that? Or you might use them all the time. Actually, idioms are used. Like if it's raining really hard, people will say, "Oh, it's raining cats and dogs." Or if someone's really busy, they'll say, "Don't burn the candle on both ends." Like, there are expressions like that that don't make literal sense, but we can infer what they mean. So here, when he said the cat was out of the bag, Steve means the secret of T1. Everyone knows about it now. You can't hide it. I guess it's the idea that you can't put a cat back in the bag once they got out of it. Maybe that's the idea. But here, that's what it means. So idioms are expressions that don't make literal sense. Next are metaphors. Metaphors are direct comparison. So if you think of, here's an example, "She's the wind when she runs." Now, that example compares a girl running to the wind blowing, and then you're supposed to infer from that she's running really fast. Okay, so they're direct comparisons as opposed to similes, which are indirect. That would be, "She's like the wind when she runs." So here you've got a direct comparison. So the first thing you're supposed to do when you find a metaphor, to see whether it's a metaphor or a simile, you should see if it's direct. So again, similes use like or as, metaphors don't. That's why it's "she is the wind when she runs." It's a direct comparison. You're calling her the wind, okay? So when you find a metaphor, the first thing you should do is ask what's being compared to what. We call that the terms of the comparison. So here you're comparing a girl running to the wind blowing, okay? And then you want to think, why is the author using that comparison? Well, it gives you a really good picture. You can picture it in your head now. Again, part of narration is to create that movie in your mind, especially that's what Preston is trying to do. And sometimes authors use similes and metaphors if they're trying to teach you something really hard. It helps to compare it to something that you already know about. That just makes it easier to learn. So an example of a metaphor from chapter 11 is, "The route took us over the Patuca River, Heineke's most dangerous place on the planet, a brown snake of water winding through the jungle." Now, there it's a direct comparison. He's not saying that the route took us over water that was like a brown snake, or he doesn't say it was like a river like a brown snake, because then you would have a simile. This is a direct comparison. He's directly calling the river a brown snake of water. And again, that's for a visual cue, so you can picture the twists and turns like you would see in a snake. You actually, if you need a picture, you have a picture of that in those inset pictures in the middle of your book. You can actually see the Patuca River, and you can see how it kind of snakes around. Okay, so again, metaphors are direct comparisons. Next, we have onomatopoeia. These are sound effect words. So if you're thinking of like the old Batman cartoons they used to have on when Batman and Robin would fight, you would see like whap, slap, bap. You'd see those words on the screen. Those are onomatopoetic because they're words that sound like what they mean. They're used for sound effects and for sensory detail. So when you're listening or you're reading a story, it's part of that movie in your mind. You can see it and understand the story better because the author's using a sound effect word that gives you an auditory cue. So here's an example from chapter 14 of The Monkey God. And I want you to know I had to really reach to find this. I don't think Preston overly likes using onomatopoeia, so, but this is the best I could find. All right, here's your example. Flocks of egrets flew below, white dots drifting against the green, and the treetops thrashed with the movements of unseen monkeys. As had been true in 2012, there was no sign of human life, not a road, trail, or wisp of smoke. So there's two words that I've highlighted in there that are somewhat onomatopoetic. The first one is thrashed, because when something thrashes, that sh sound is made, right? You can hear it. And so that word is a bit onomatopoetic. And then you have the word wisp, which has that sound. And again, that helps you understand the smoke. So they're words that gives you sound effects. They're hard to find. In your assignment, I don't think you're going to find too many of those. I really had to search for that example. Okay, next we have personification. This is when you give human-like qualities to something that is not human. So if you think about why authors might choose to do that, sometimes it's to personalize something. The word that's in the next bullet on the slide you may not know. The word is anthropomorphize. When you do that, you are giving human qualities to something. So for example, if you think of all the Disney movies you've ever seen, like I'm thinking of Beauty and the Beast, candlesticks don't sing. They've been anthropomorphized, right? So all of a sudden you had that candlestick that had like arms. I'm trying to remember, his name was Lumiere, I think, right? So he had like arms now, and he had a face, and all of that is giving human characteristics to something. And so that's what anthropomorphize means. So then, let me go over the example. This is from chapter 11. I was struck by the valley's picturesque topography, the ring of mountains embracing a gentle rolling landscape divided by two rivers. So in this example, you've got the ideas, I've highlighted it there, it's the ideas of the mountains embracing something. It sounds like the mountains have arms and they're hugging it, right? The ring of mountains embracing a gentle rolling landscape. It's as if the mountains reached out their arms and hugged the rolling landscape. We know mountains don't have arms, so it's odd to say that they're embracing something. So that is an example of personification. It sounds soft and nice. When we embrace something, we're usually comforting it. So it makes the landscape sound really nice. Remember Preston's impression of the jungle? He really describes it as quite beautiful. I mean, we get this impression that it's this gorgeous place. Even though once you get on the ground, it's so dangerous. And so that kind of fits with how Preston describes most of the jungle. All right, then we have similes. And again, those are the kind of sister to metaphors. Metaphors are direct comparisons, similes are indirect. So I gave you the example on the metaphor slide that it's the example. So a metaphor is she is the wind when she runs, and then a simile is she's like the wind. It's indirect, right? You're not saying she is the wind, you're saying she's just like it. Okay? Or if you use as, it's she's as fast as the wind when she runs, and that would be using as. So similes use like or as. They're actually the easiest ones to find because they use like and as. And it's the same reasons as metaphors. Authors use them to create a better picture and so that your movie in your mind is better. So if you look in chapter 11, Here's your example. The tree crowns were packed together like puffballs. So you can see the word like is actually providing the terms of the comparison. So here you have tree crowns being compared to puffballs. And so why would Preston set that comparison up? You need to think about that. And the idea being that when you're looking at like a jungle, the layers of a rainforest, the trees look like little puffballs sticking up out of the canopy. And so that's what he wants you to picture. Again, Preston uses really pretty language to describe the jungle because, again, from the sky, it's quite lovely. It's not dangerous till they land there. Okay, so then I have I think there's 3 left, and these I think are a little bit harder, but I am required in 960 to make sure you've at least heard of these. I don't predict that they'll be in your homework assignment. I think you're going to lean heavily on similes and metaphors and personification. You might find some hyperboles as well, but in general, these are harder. And so I am going to go over them, but know that you probably won't find examples in Preston's book for them. So the first one is a euphemism. And a euphemism is when you soften language in order to protect the people you're talking to. For example, people don't go to funerals and walk up to the front of the room to the family that's lost somebody and they don't say, yeah, I'm really sorry your dad died. Like, we just don't say that. So instead we soften our language and we say something nicer and more socially acceptable for the situation. So you'll walk up to the front of the funeral parlor and you'll say, I'm really sorry for your loss, or I'm sure your dad's in a better place now. You say things like that, and those are euphemisms for death. Then other ideas for euphemisms are really, if you Google this, you'll find that humans use euphemisms for almost every bodily function. Humans are very uncomfortable with their biology, and so in general, we have them for everything. So if you Google that, you'll laugh for a long time because you'll see that I'm right. All right, so again, euphemisms are a softening of language in order to protect your audience. Now, doublespeak, I always call it the evil stepchild of euphemism, because the idea is that it's still a softening of language, but now you're using it to manipulate your audience instead of protect them. So doublespeak is language that's supposed to confuse you. For example, a lot of lawyers use this kind of language. The military might use it. Politicians are going to use it all the time. Doctors, anytime someone's in a position where they may not want their audience to understand everything they're saying. So let me give you an example. My neighbor actually was fired from her job one day, and she was so upset about this. When I talked to her, she was crying. She was so mad because she said that they called her into their office and they said, you know what, we would like to offer you an involuntary lifestyle reduction. That's an example of doublespeak. It's a softening of language. They didn't say, you're fired, right? Because that is harsh and upsetting. So instead, they twisted the language so it was confusing, so that my neighbor listened and said, what? You're giving me what? And they said, oh, we'd like to offer this to you. It's an involuntary lifestyle reduction. And she's thinking, what is happening? And it happened all so fast. And then she's saying thank you, because when someone offers you something, you're supposed to say thank you. And then they kind of rushed her out of the office and she was escorted out of the building. And she's going, am I being fired? Because she couldn't figure it out the whole time. Well, that was done on purpose, just to mislead her and just to confuse her. That's done on purpose, right? And so that they don't have a scene, they don't have you going, what, I'm fired, and you make a big scene in the office, right? So doublespeak, again, is language meant to confuse. I was on a field trip once, and a teacher lost a kid, and so she came up to me and she said, Jan, there's been a bit of a head count adjustment. Well, that was... Well, I guess you can decide whether she was using that as a euphemism to protect people or use it to confuse everyone, because she did not want to admit the fact that she lost one. So to call it a head count adjustment is just a different way to say it. So that's the difference between a euphemism and doublespeak. Now, I do have an example from Monkey God, but again, I don't think you'll find many more as you go through the chapter. This is from chapter 14. If the engine fails, there is no glide. The pilot must try to execute an unpowered descent, which is a euphemism for dropping out of the sky like a stone. Now, you can imagine if you're on an airplane and the pilot comes over the loudspeaker and says, flight attendants, please prepare for an unpowered descent. That they are trying to protect you. You might say, well, that's actually doublespeak because they're trying to confuse everybody. But I think at that point, they don't want to say, we're crashing, right? Like, it just sounds better to say an unpowered descent. And so that is an example of, and Preston even names it for you, a euphemism. And he says for dropping out of the sky, there's your simile, like a stone. However, he means it might crash. Okay, so that's some examples of manipulative language. Again, I'm required to talk to you about those, but I don't think you'll have examples of these on your homework. The last one, you might find an example of this in the pages I'm asking you to look at, but again, if you don't worry about it. Allusions can be really hard. So allusions are what we call literary references. The reason that these are so hard is because they're often referencing text that you may not have background knowledge for. So most allusions in our dominant culture come from the Bible or from like folk tales or myths or fairy tales, places like that. And if you didn't grow up here and you don't know a lot of the fairy tales, or if you are not a Christian and you haven't read the Bible, then you might have a lot of trouble understanding the different allusions that are used. Right? And so they can be hard and you don't always pick up on them. So I'm going to show you an example and I'm going to talk about what the allusion is to and why Preston might have used it. This is from chapter 14. Following the slashed leaves and vines like breadcrumbs, I retraced the trail to the center of camp. This is again when Preston is lost in the woods. He's about to find the snake. But the line that's an allusion is he's following the slashed leaves and vines like breadcrumbs. This is an allusion to Hansel and Gretel. It's a a fairy tale about a brother and sister who leave their house and they go to a witch's house and they leave breadcrumbs so that they can find their way back. And so that is an allusion to that fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel. Now, it didn't work for Hansel and Gretel, so obviously it didn't work for Preston either, and maybe that's why it's an accurate allusion. So again, allusions are literary references to other works, but they can also be to pop culture, to like song titles and TV shows and things like that. One of my son's favorite shows is Psych, and they constantly make allusions to like 90s pop culture and stuff like that. And my son wasn't alive then, obviously, so he doesn't get a lot of them. And like I'm laughing and he doesn't know why. Well, there's an allusion for you. Sometimes you don't have the background knowledge for them. Okay, so here's your job. Now we've gotten to your assignment. I've gone through all of the different types of figurative language, and here's your assignment. So you have all of these different ones to choose from. You have similes, metaphors, personification. Again, those are the ones you're going to find the most. You might find some hyperboles, maybe an allusion, maybe an idiom, maybe onomatopoeia. But again, just find what you can. And your job is to find at least 10. I want you to start on page 130. You have to page 135. And you're going to type this. So I want you to have 4 different parts to each answer. Part 1, you need to type the example. So give me the sentence from the text with the page number. Then I want you to classify it. What type of figurative language is it? Pick from the list. What are you looking at? Is it a simile, a metaphor, an allusion? What do you have? Then explain the term. If you've got a simile or metaphor, you should be able to explain to me what is being compared to what. Allusions also, by the way. So even personification, what are they comparing, right? So when she runs like the wind, you need to be able to say, oh, the terms of the comparison are they're comparing a girl running to the wind blowing, right? I want to know the terms. And then I want you to explain, finally, why you think Preston uses this type of figurative language and how it impacts your reading of the story. Okay, find 10 It's okay to repeat types. I think you'll have to repeat types. You're going to have mostly similes, metaphors, and personification. You might have one or two of the others, or you might not. You might find all similes and metaphors, and that's okay. I just want to see that you can find this stuff. Those 5 pages that I've guided you to are so full of figurative language, you should have no trouble coming to 10. All right, so I've given you an example. And this is from page 130, so I took one of them from you, but I think you'll still be okay. So my example is, it sounded like some giant machine or dynamo had been started and was cranking up to full speed. All right, so you see I put it in quotation marks and I've got the page number there, right? And that follows MLA citation style, so make sure you get that right. I've also told you it's a simile. You can see the second bullet. The terms, Preston is comparing the sound the howler monkeys made to some giant machine or dynamo cranking up to full speed. So the terms are the monkey's sound to a machine cranking up. Okay? And then you can read the paragraph as to why I thought Preston used this. It has a lot to do with what I thought howler monkeys sounded like. I always thought they sounded, I don't know, like scary, like a ghost or something, and they don't. I've listened to them. I think actually I even Googled that while we were in class the other day, and I played a sound file of it for you. They do sound like machines. They sound more industrial. They do not sound like ghosts. And so I think he wanted us to know that, and he also wanted us to know how loud they are. All right, you can read the paragraph I wrote there if you need to. Okay, so that's the example of what you're doing. Your job is to find 10. So here, let me wrap this up. You're going to go to the assignment for Figurative Language Dive. You're going to find 10 examples of figurative language. Start on page 130, go to page 135. You should have no trouble finding 10 examples in those 5 pages. Make sure that you give me the passage with the page number, explain what type of figurative language you're looking at, what Preston is comparing to what. That's the terms of the comparison. Now, if you've got an idiom, there are no terms, right? If you have a hyperbole, there's no terms. So your terms of comparison are only for similes, metaphors, personification, and allusions. And then explain why you think Preston used it. So, for example, by the way, if you pull a hyperbole out and you get to that terms question, you can just write not applicable or NA or something, because you don't have to do the terms if it doesn't apply. All right, let me know if you have any questions about this assignment, but that is the Figurative Language Dive assignment. Good luck and have fun.